You could say that the survival horror genre has been doing well for quite some time, and though some may disagree with that, my feelings are that it's at its strongest it's been in a long time. It's not only thanks to Capcom mostly delivering the goods with its Resident Evil remakes, but also with 7 and 8 largely pleasing the majority of fans. While all of that's true, at the same time, you can't disregard the efforts and successes of the survival horror indie scene. Whether it be with games such as Signalis or Nightmare of Decay, there's plenty out there to keep survival horror fans happy. While not specifically a survival horror game, I'd still like to add the Tartarus key to that list. When compared to the early Resident Evil games, it's not exactly like them, but it's hard to ignore the influences of TTK. In fact, it's one of the reasons why TTK stood out to me in the first place. I was on Twitter when I saw a tweet advertising TTK. What immediately stood out to me were its PS1-styled graphics. I know I'm biased because I was around and a fan of that era of gaming, so it's hard not to feel nostalgic or pulled in when I see a game like TTK. Once I started playing, I knew that I'd end up loving it. That might come off as me getting ahead of myself, but it's because TTK did a lot right straight from the start. Its visuals were what drew me in, but the more I played, the more I saw that it was more than a throwback to the PS1 era of gaming. Besides the PS1 graphics, I thought that the in-game character icons were awesome. They reminded me of the ones from the NES Metal Gear games. It's great when a game can balance detailed and rough-looking artwork at the same time. Back in the 80s and 90s, this was done mainly due to limitations that forced devs to deliver this kind of result, but it's clear that modern retro-styled games do this because they want to. Alongside simply looking cool, I like the sound that was used when text passed. It's a small detail, but seeing as how there's no voice acting and a great deal of TTK involves dialogue, it was a good choice to make it so that this part of the game would be pleasing rather than frustrating to put up with. Despite enjoying the in-game character icons and the sound when dialogue was shown on screen, I eventually grew to be annoyed by this. It wasn't because I felt that it was overused or anything like that, but it was because I encountered an annoying bug. I don't know if it's because I played on my Steam Deck or what, but more than once I encountered a bug where my latest save would disappear. I'm glad that I had multiple saves that weren't too far apart from each other, because if I hadn't done that, chances are that I would have had to have gone back further than I would have liked. This was made even more annoying due to the fact that I couldn't skip cutscenes. I'd have to completely replay sections I'd already gone through, followed by trying to go through the dialogue/cutscenes as quickly as possible. It's possible that this option wasn't available because the devs wanted players to fully digest TTK and the story it had to tell, but it still would have been nice to have included a quality of life feature such as this one. Even when I didn't encounter this bug, I forced myself to replay sections. It's because I wanted to save every character I found. Sometimes I'd do something wrong and this would lead to the characters dying. I can see the pros of going along with that happening, seeing as how those were the results of my actions, but at the same time, I wanted the game to go how I wanted it to. This isn't entirely related to the bug I previously mentioned, but it's another instance where being able to skip cutscenes would have been nice. Not being able to skip extensive dialogue/cutscenes sucked, but it helped that the playable character, Alex, had a lot of personality. This wasn't just seen in her conversation with other characters, but also with her observations. Much like in the classic Resident Evil and Silent Hill games, you could click on mundane objects and see what Alex had to say. Sometimes it was an observation as simple as, "I can't make use of that object," to, "Oh god, that's gross and I don't want to be near it." I like that because it helped lighten the mood. I know it's possible for a game to be absolutely grim for the entirety of its duration, but at the same time, light moments make heavy moments stand out even more because of the contrast. It didn't take long for me to realize that TTK is a game with amazing atmosphere. A lot went into that, but that was also largely due to the game's music. At times the music was relaxing, but then it was more ambient, and at times it was the good kind of creepy. Being a fan of a wide variety of music, it's nice when games go out of their way to make it so that all their soundtracks are more than just background noise. When utilized correctly, it elevates a game to the next level, and that's how it was in TTK. There were occasional moments where there were abrupt changes in music, which resulted in coming off as upbeat, but it still managed to fit, and I saw that as a good thing. It's because it managed to add a bit of variety while staying within the musical lane that was chosen. Unsurprisingly, a great deal of this review will focus on TTK's puzzles. Seeing as how TTK is pretty much an escape room styled game, it's not a surprise at all. From the first puzzle, I was pleased with how things were set up. The first clues that were available to you helped steer you in the right direction, but the rest you had to figure out on your own. As if that wasn't enough, TTK also made use of a misleading clue. In this particular puzzle, this was done by including a Japanese postcard. In the moment, it can be viewed as part of what will lead to the solution, but after carefully looking at the available clues, you realize that it's just meant to mislead you. I want to say that wasn't featured in the rest of TTK's puzzles, but it's possible that I'm overlooking one or more instances when this was used. When it comes to TTK's puzzles, there was a lot of variety that ranged from easy to hard. What's great is that besides offering different challenges, the puzzles themselves would change. There were a handful that relied on you figuring out a keypad code, but I'd say that 90% of the puzzles offered different styles. As much as I enjoyed Resident Evil 7, I have to dog on it a little because one of my issues with it is that it didn't do a good job with its puzzles. The problem is that Resident Evil 7 really only offered one kind of puzzle, the one that involved trying to match up shadows with paintings. That wasn't the case at all in TTK, and that's one of its strengths. Despite being mostly content with the different types of puzzles and how challenging they were or weren't, some just left me feeling absolutely confused. At the same time, some were very intuitive, so it didn't take long for me to figure out what needed to be done. I realize it's probably something not worth patting your back over, but it made me feel good when I could stumble upon a puzzle and more or less have it solved in less than a minute. On the other hand, there were puzzles where I was stumped to the point where I didn't even know where to begin. This mainly occurred with puzzles that were really specific. Two immediately come to mind. One involves spelling out death by using animal posters, and the other involves statues of angels, demons, other mythical figures, and a painting. Once I realized what needed to be done, things made sense, but before that, I didn't know what to do. It didn't help that TTK sometimes offered more information than was necessary, and this resulted in me overthinking. You could say I should have just remembered the saying, the obvious answer is most likely the right one, but thanks to having experienced puzzles that required a lot of planning and thought before solving, it was easy to have that approach in mind when encountering new puzzles. Though that definitely led to me feeling frustrated, I love it when a game forces me to take notes. Not only does it show that a lot of thought went into it, but I like having to interact with something outside of a game in order to progress. The result is a more fleshed out experience that goes beyond what's restricted to whichever screen you happen to be playing on. Even if taking notes and photos occasionally helped with some of the puzzles, there were a handful that left me feeling like a complete idiot. Occasionally I could brute force my way to a solution, much like when I used guess and check with the colored bottles puzzle, but that wasn't always an option. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I had to use a guide a handful of times to overcome certain puzzles. One that immediately comes to mind was the antidote puzzle that needed to be completed in order to rescue Ruth, one of the other characters in TTK. I felt ashamed because other puzzles were easy for me, and even if they weren't, I could still use the clues that were available to me to come to a solution. It's possible that I could have done this with all of the puzzles, but the truth is that I reached a point where I just wanted to beat the game. According to how long to beat, it should take around 4 to 5 hours to beat TTK, but my overall playtime with it was almost 19 hours. I realize that gives off the idea that I was horrible when it came to this game, but the bug I mentioned earlier didn't make things any easier. In general, I was happy with pretty much all of the puzzles. It would have been nice if I could have quickly picked up on what needed to be done with all of them, but if it were like that, then I'm sure that I'd be complaining about the puzzles being way too easy. Something else that's worth mentioning is that some of the puzzles were multi-layered. They were all separate puzzles, usually within one area or room, but it was frustrating to be stuck on one knowing that you needed to overcome it to be able to advance. I'm not entirely sure about this, but based on what I can recall, I know that the puzzles in the storage space took me way more time than I would have liked. There was one part of it that was easy for me to take care of because all I needed to do was use a black light and fingerprints in order to figure out the code for the keypad. It didn't take long for me to realize that the fingerprints range from the darkest imprint left to the lightest. It was easy to make the connection that the lightest one would be the last digit and the darkest would be the first. It depends on your point of view and what you consider difficult, but I really felt good about myself when I saw that connection and was able to get the code right. Do I feel that the puzzles were perfect? No. What I will say is that it's clear that a lot of thought and effort went into ensuring that TTK would deliver awesome puzzles. I know I've largely discussed their difficulty, but the themes and solutions also help take them to the next level. If someone were to ask me to describe TTK, I'd say that it's like Resident Evil and Silent Hill without combat. That description may make some run away, but at the same time, I know that some wouldn't mind that, seeing as how there's more to Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and survival horror in general besides combat. It wasn't just because of what TTK largely features, but also because there were small tidbits that stand out as sort of Easter eggs used in reference to Resident Evil. I could just be full of it, but I'm specifically referring to the cheesy music that plays during the end of the game. It's cheesy, but I liked it, and it reminded me of Resident Evil's Still Dawn. Though I do have some complaints about TTK, my general opinion is that this is an awesome game. I like that it wore its influences on its sleeve while still managing to do its own thing. TTK isn't a survival horror game, but there's enough here to satisfy survival horror junkies. It might be seen as a strange statement to make, but TTK's greatest strength and weakness lies in its use of puzzles. I know that there are some out there that'll eat up these puzzles and be begging for seconds, but I'm also sure that some out there will regularly need a helping hand to advance through the game. At the end of the day, play the way that best fits your playtest lifestyle. I like to think that games are best enjoyed almost or completely blind, But much like I mentioned a bit earlier, every once in a while, doing so will result in frustration or feeling stumped. Either way, the Tartarus key offers a lot that's sure to satisfy players that are heavily into horror and puzzle-based games. As of this writing, it's worth $19.99, and despite having received a key for this game, I'd say it's worth it. How do you feel about using tips or a guide in order to keep advancing through a game? Would you go out of your way to avoid playing a game that looks too retro? If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, share, and if you're up for it, become a patron. Thank you very much for watching.